Welcome to Tuesday. It's not only my weekly YouTube live stream day, but it's also the name of, well, this flying frog book that so many of you encounter in your formal autism diagnostic assessments. But why? Hey friends, I'm Mike, a late identified autistic adult, and today we are going to talk about flying frogs and what they have to do with autism, because being handed a picture book like this during a formal autism assessment, particularly as an adult, makes as much sense as a squirrel trying to use a smartphone. But before I start, I am going to talk about one of the tasks within one of the autism diagnostic assessment toolkits. So this might affect how you perceive or perform the task yourself. If you have a formal assessment booked in with a clinician who uses the ADOS2, you might want to bookmark this video and come back to it later after your assessment. This video is book spoiler free, so we're not going to go through this book in this video. If you are curious as to how a frog book ended up in an autism assessment, you can still watch the video and then be able to perform the task in your assessment without spoilers. But I'm just letting you know in advance. Does that make sense? Okay, everyone ready? Great. So, autism is a heterogeneous neurodevelopmental condition, meaning that if you have met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. And since there is a need for a repeatable and trusted standard for diagnosticians to follow in appointments, bearing in mind there are thousands, many thousands of potential diagnosticians, and they're all going to be slightly subjective in their own ways, various standards have been created to meet this need. One of these standards is the ADOS2, or the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule 2nd edition. And for just £2,499, excluding VAT, which is around $4,000 US, you will receive this plastic trunk filled with what looks like the contents of a garage or jumble sale. One of the items in the box is the frog book. As an aside, I actually remember my own diagnostic appointments like they were yesterday. I had 3 in total. I put some toy Matchbox cars in my pocket and produced them fairly early on and asked my assessor if they would like me to play with them or line them up or something. Now I know it is a little bit strange, it's just my humour, and it is my way of handling stress, maybe take the piss a little bit, but for me, the ADOS2 wasn't used. I had the DISCO, or Diagnostic Interview for Social and Communication Disorders, and that formed part of the interview section of my process and not the ADOS2, but just like the ADOS and the DISCO, there are several other standards available for professional clinicians to use. They're all optional, but they're available. And it reminds me of that famous XKCD comic about technical standards. It says, "How standards proliferate." Situation: there are 14 competing standards. So we need to develop one universal standard that covers everyone's use cases. Result: there are 15 competing standards. In autism diagnostics, we have a very similar situation with multiple assessment tools and standards, each with its own approach. It's also worth remembering that none of these tools or standards are necessary. They aren't the diagnostic criteria themselves. What they do is they map repeatable tasks and processes to the diagnostic criteria. So if you didn't have the frog book, I didn't, or even if you did, it doesn't change whether or not you are autistic or not. It doesn't affect or speak to the underlying diagnostic criteria. It's just a repeatable tool that some people use. Does that make sense? In order to understand where the frogs come from, we first have to look at the ADIR, or the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised. Now, this is sometimes given in addition to the ADOS2, and it's a structured interview. It's a checklist effectively, and it covers early development, communication, social interaction, and repetitive or restricted behaviours. Stimming to you and me. There's also the 3DI, which sounds like an old school PC graphics card, but this one is the Developmental, Dimensional and Diagnostic Interview, and it is computerized, and this is a questionnaire, so you can do it online, but it costs about $1,000 to access. These must be some very clever questions. Then there's the CARS 2, not that CARS 2, but the Childhood Autism Rating Scale 2nd edition. It's pretty pathological, as its main selling point is determining symptom severity. Now, autism doesn't necessarily have symptom severity. In fact, their updated, quote, new form for higher functioning individuals tells me everything I need to know about how up to date they actually are. Functioning labels are very outdated for very good reasons that I've gone into in this earlier video. Anyway, the CARS 2 kit is about $500 to $700. There's also the GARS 3, or Gilliam Autism Rating Scale, 3rd edition, which is also focused on severity. It's just 56 behavioural questions, which give a score at the end. It's more of a screening questionnaire for teachers and parents to use, rather than for autistic people themselves, or on autistic adults, as it were. And this kit costs about $100. The SRS2, or Social Responsiveness Scale, 2nd edition, that one measures social impairment with respect to neurotypical socialising, of course. It always is. And it also gives a severity score. Nice. This tool, it's basically just a form that takes about 15 to 20 minutes to complete, is available for about $800. Now, I'm sure there are more. Let me know if you know of any. The only one that stands out as not an expensive kit is the Disco, which is face-to-face, 4-day-ish training course delivered by the UK's National Autistic Society. The Disco is, from what I can tell, a much more appropriate diagnostic interview. It's optimised for adults rather than for children. It can work when there is little to no early history or behavioural data from childhood, and it also doesn't require taking an unnecessarily pathologized view that the other diagnostic tools, they do seem to lean quite heavily onto the excessively pathological kind of angle. Does this make sense at all? Anyway, back to the ADOS 2. Within the ADOS 2 itself, modules 3 and 4 are specifically designed for participants who have fluent speech. Module 3 is tailored for children and teenagers, and Module 4 is very much like Module 3, but it's slightly adapted for older teenagers and adults. And both of these modules will see you being handed the frog book. Now, this isn't the first time the ADOS 2 used a frog book. The original frog book, called Frog, Where Are You?, was used for a long time, well before Tuesday was published. The people behind the ADOS really do seem to have a thing for frogs. The purpose of this task is to bring out spontaneous narrative ability, social communication and inference, to test for internal state language and so on. The assessor is likely to hand you the book and say something like, "Tell me a story from the pictures." They might model 1 or 2 pages and ask you to continue turning the pages and narrating what you see and making inferences. So it is structured, but it still leaves a lot of room for what the participant brings themselves. They want to see how much detail you provide, how you link events, what emotions or intentions you're ascribing to the characters, how you might use gestures, and whether or not you ask questions or seek clarification. Now, I don't actually own a copy of the ADOS 2 modules 3 and 4 myself, which means I don't know how or what the assessor sees maps directly to the DSM criteria. The original paper, which assessed the validity of using Module 4 to screen for autism in adults, well, that used a tiny sample of 16 diagnosed autistic adults in 47 total subjects. They couldn't tell the difference between who was autistic or PDD-NOS at that time anyway. Module 4 was updated in 2014, which made it more accurate, although this study, published in BMC Psychiatry in 2001, looking at the accuracy of the ADOS 2 Module 4, found that, and I quote, ADOS 2 scores failed to predict the diagnostic outcome. Overall sensitivity, 92%. Specificity, 57%. We'll get to that in a moment. Interestingly, scores from the restricted interests component of the ADOS 2 have the potential to predict diagnostic outcome, despite this domain not being included in the scoring algorithm. So what that means, in simpler terms, is that the ADOS 2 was pretty good at finding people who are actually autistic. Okay? Now, it wasn't good at correctly identifying people who were not autistic. This means that Module 4 sometimes suggests people might be autistic when they aren't. Although this study does say that part of Module 4 that screens for restricted interests, I call them passions, seemed to be helpful in predicting who actually was autistic, even though the makers of ADOS 2 did not include this in the final scoring element. It's like finding out that a question that you did on a test didn't count towards your final grade, but actually that question was a really good predictor of how well you understood the subject. And I mean, if you had the task of identifying an autistic person, wouldn't one of the first things you do be to ask them about their passions or so-called special interests? I mean, it's literally a no-brainer. It would be for me. Many autistic adults have expressed frustration at being handed a children's picture book during their diagnostic assessment. And I know how that must feel. Like you're in the wrong place. And it's quite a vulnerable time in your life as well. And it can be incredibly, it can be a lot. It can be really intense. And then to be handed a children's picture book, it can really dysregulate you. It can feel infantilizing, especially when you're seeking professional validation of your neurotype and you're an adult. You may even be older than the assessor. It's all a little bit weird. But drop a frog emoji in the comments below and let me know that you got this far. And subscribe, like, share. Remember those things. Remember, it is YouTube after all. Now I'm going to have to do some reverse engineering here as I don't actually own an ADOS 2 kit, but there are training materials that I have found online. I even found the ADOS 2 module for data schema, which finally should give me something to go on. Right, what do they have here? Well, an integer score from 1 of 4 levels with a default catch-all at the end. They've got 0. If you scored 0, 0 means several different spontaneous, inventive, creative activities or comments in conversation. Okay? 0 autism. 1. Some creative or make-believe actions, but limited in range or occurring only in response to one structured situation, such as creating a story. 2. Little spontaneous creative or make-believe actions, or only actions that are repetitive or stereotyped in quality. 3. No creative or inventive actions, not even stereotyped or repetitive. Stereotyped or repetitive means stimming. It means basically no stimming. Number 3, for some reason. 9. Cannot be rated for some reason other than that listed above, such as if the examiner makes an error or does not administer a particular ADOS activity. There's also a string called observation D2, which is basically a free text field. And I'm going to guess it's just the name of the book or just some miscellaneous comments. It looks like it's possible to see what data exists for the 1,000+ diagnostic reports here, and I don't think that field is being used much at all. I've also seen instructions that grade the specific behaviours in this section of the ADOS 2 manual from 0 to 3, where higher means a more pronounced difference to realistic standards, and they convert the number down by 1 point for this module. That seems to indicate that even the makers of the ADOS 2 are taking this task with a pinch of salt, as they say. Please don't read too much into this, as I said before. We are now so far away from the waters around discussion of autism and neurodiversity. Don't forget, we've firstly got the ICD and DSM diagnostic manuals. They're not perfect, but we have them. And then the organisations producing standardised testing kits that map tasks to the diagnostic criteria. That's a whole industry that sort of sits on top. And then you've got the tasks themselves, like the frog book. And then when you consider that there's actually a significant risk that subjectivity creeps in at each stage. And specificity, that's the ability for the diagnostic standard to discriminate between, say, autism and not autism. Right? That sort of getting a bit weaker along the chain. And I'm not completely convinced that any of this makes much difference anyway. But then again, on the flip side, the book does provide a standard experience, maybe to less experienced diagnosticians. It could be quite helpful. I'd rather they had a schema, a set of instructions that they were following, right? If your diagnostician is using the ADOS 2 and hands you a picture book to tell them a story, well, it is going to be this one. It is going to be the frog book. And all good diagnosticians will know to interpret the results of the ADOS 2 with caution anyway. Starting my YouTube channel has put me on a really unexpected journey of learning and practicing social communication skills. I am today much better at social communication than I was 2 years ago before my channel started. Does that mean that I've become less autistic by being autistic AF? No, absolutely not. So I wonder, how does those of us, often women, or other autists who have learned strategies, how do people like that who perform perhaps better on this task, masking any social differences, well, that would mean that the ADOS then would undercapture your real difficulties or overestimate your strengths even. Like someone watching one of my YouTube videos might find that in person I'm a much less skilled communicator than I come across on an edited YouTube video. where I've got my notes and stuff. Just the quiet room. Does that make sense? Also, not every adult's narrative style fits into telling a story from a picture book either, whether they're autistic or not. The ADOS 2 was never intended, by the way, to be a standalone one-size-fits-all autism detector. Although you'd expect that it probably would be. It should be very good at picking up autism for £2,500, $4,000.
Not according to my PKE meter, Peter.
It should be pretty good, but it's not quite there. So if you're waiting for an assessment, don't worry, clinicians know. The frog book just gets talked about online a lot because it's rather surprising as an adult to be confronted with it during an assessment. And at least if you've seen this video, you now know why you're being asked to tell a story about flying frogs or toads on lily pads. At least they're not handing you any of the other things from that kit, like the dolls or whatever, right? Anyway, let me know if you were handed Tuesday in your autism assessment. Drop frog emojis in the comments below, please. What story did you come up with? Now, I live stream every Tuesday right here on YouTube from 7:30 p.m. UK time, so maybe I'll see you on one of the live streams. Bring your frogs with you, they're welcome. See you later, bye.